This video will walk you through the steps of creating more of a sketchy outline, so more of a realistic shading and drawing, so something like this within your image. There's a lot of layers that we're going to be working with, but first you'll want to start with your background layer. So go ahead and open up a background image that you want to start working with, and then we'll be walking through the steps of the different layers here. The layer that the image that I'm going to be working with, I'm going to add a new layer, and this is going to be the layer that I'm outlining and shading on with black. So I'm going to grab black from my paintbrush here, and I'm going to make that size fairly small brush. And remember that the little brackets underneath delete button on your keyboard is the shortcut to change the size of your paintbrush. So something like this will work well. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, maybe make this slightly smaller. And again, if you choose this little folder at the top, you can select different types of brushes. I'm just going to use a regular brush for this, but you might want to choose one that has more of an angled edge as you're working and as you're shading things in. But what I'm going to do as I start shading is just start looking for all of the areas of shadow, so all of the darker areas in the image. So in the hair, I'm looking at some of these darker spots. I'm not necessarily going over every single detail of the hair, but looking for some of the general areas that I can start to shade in and just following the direction of the image. So instead of just doing straight up and down as I'm shading, I'm trying to follow the curve of the hair. So I'm just going to fill in a few of those spots. So I would finish going through the rest of the hair there. I'm going to zoom in and show a little bit with shading in an eye and different parts of the image. But with the eye, you're going to want to just follow some of that detail with outlines and shading. Remember, if you have this button selected, so adjusting the pressure of the pen, while you're shading with the tablet, as you press lightly, it will create lighter lines versus pressing a lot harder on the tablet, creating thicker lines. So you can vary the amount of pressure that you are shading in with the tablet. So in areas like this, around the eye where there's slight shadows, I'm just lightly shading with my brush. And this might be an area where I'll make that brush a little bit smaller so we can get more of the details. So outlining some of these lines around the eyes. Again, just shading that in. Outlining some of these details in the eye. Going over some of the texture. So again, as I'm shading, I'm not shading straight up and down, but I'm looking for those areas that curve on the face and trying to follow the directional lines of the face. So on the cheek here, it comes out and around and kind of curves down, so I can shade that in. So I'm just going through all of those areas and adjusting the amount of pressure that I'm outlining with. And as I'm shading, instead of just outlining certain areas or holding the brush down constantly, I'm shading back and forth fairly quickly in some of these spots to just give it a little bit more texture and a little bit more of that shading technique. So when you're finished, it should look something like this with the details of the shading with the face. So if you hide your background layer, and I have a solid color in the background, but if you hide that background layer, you should be able to see a good amount of detail on your picture. So again, areas like this with the teeth, I'm really taking my time shading to go over a lot of that detail. Again, on the lips, I'm not just drawing lines straight up and down, but I'm shading quickly back and forth, trying to follow the curve of the lips. So once you have that black layer done and you've shaded in all the dark value change, I would add a new layer and make sure that layer is underneath what you were drawing, so underneath the layer that you shaded on. Grab your paint bucket and choose a color that you want to fill it in with. Try to find a medium value. So on mine I had that medium value gray. You can choose a different color if you would like. But what I'm going to show you next is adding highlights. So instead of doing white in the background, I would choose a medium value so you can work with some different highlights and bringing those back. So let me show you what those highlights will look like. So here's the highlight layer that I'm going to talk about next. So that brings a lot more form and dimension to your image versus if you just had a white background, then you're going to lose all of that value change. So I would recommend a medium value. You can also use the gradient tool. If you click and hold down that paint bucket, the gradient tool is there. And this would be something that could be interesting if you do maybe 2 different colors for that medium value. So let's grab a blue as well. And then if you click and drag across, it will add that in. So I'm just going to bring this gray layer back, and I'm going to hide that white layer so we can talk about adding highlights. I'm going to also hide the black layer for now and just bring the main picture back. And with the paintbrush, I'm going to switch my color to white. So I'm double clicking on that square, selecting white. And again, you can use really any paintbrush that you would like. But from there, I'm going to add a new layer. And I'm going to look for the areas of highlight. So when you're looking for areas to highlight, look for areas of the picture that are a lot lighter. So I have this white outline on the outside here that I can go over. And again, I'm doing a little bit more with shading versus just one line. So I'm shading back and forth here, looking for areas that are a little bit lighter. If it helps, you can go up to Image at the top of your screen and then down to Adjustments and make that picture black and white. So that might help for you to be able to pick out where those white values are within your image. Let me click on the correct layer. So again, Image, Adjustments, black and white. And this might help you to see those areas that are lighter. Just getting rid of that color for now might help. So I'm just going around and outlining all of those areas that are in highlight with white. So I'm shading those in. Don't forget the eyes. Look for maybe some texture you can add in there. And some texture on top. And I actually did not switch back to my new layer for my white layer, so make sure you're always on the right layer and never drawing on that background. So I would have to do Command Z to undo and get rid of that before moving on. But look at maybe the teeth or any highlights in the gums that you can add a little bit to. And with the hair, there's a lot of those areas that you can go back and add some of the highlights. So mainly in the middle here of the hair. So you'd go through and shade all of that in. So when you're done, you can hide your background image, bring back that white layer, and this is what my white layer looks like. So again, you can see a lot of those highlights along the nose, the eyes, hair, teeth, a little bit on the wrinkles of the shirt. And then when I bring my black layer back, it again has a lot of dimension with it. And something else you can play around with is the background. So again, you could try maybe different colors like this. I outlined or went in with a thicker paintbrush and went around my picture so that I have just the focal point or just the person here as the gray tone, so that that separates the focal point from the background. So you could maybe use a bigger brush size and shade that background in. And then one additional thing that I did here as well that can help is just one more layer of black and white with the paintbrush. So for this layer, I went in with a bigger paintbrush and picked out just the biggest or the brightest areas of highlight, and I shaded over those areas. And then I picked out the darkest shadows and shaded over those areas. So give that a try with some of these steps and see what you can do with your picture and how you can try to really focus on shading highlights and shadows on separate layers. Thing that I do want to mention that could be interesting with this is if you bring a little bit of color back. So you could either unhide your picture layer and lower that opacity so you have just a little bit of color underneath, or maybe you are taking your paintbrush and on a layer on top using a low opacity and playing around with adding just some random different colors to it. So I would use a feathered brush for this with, again, a low opacity on your paintbrush, and maybe just throw in some different areas of color. So let me bring that up a little bit more. So maybe on the shirt I'm throwing in some purple that kind of goes into the background, maybe some areas on the skin that I can throw some color into. So that could be something interesting again to play around with, is just trying to add a touch of color to some areas. I can grab, oops. I can grab another color, so maybe some pinks I can throw in there. So be creative with this and how you want to kind of finalize and touch up some different areas in your picture. There's also a time lapse of me completing this whole drawing, so be sure to check that video out as well.